What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the stream. If this is your first time hearing this content, if you like it, consider hitting the like button, consider subscribing to this channel. So today's video is going to be about the next series here, developing apps on EOS as a pleb. So if you guys recall my last playlist or episode on this particular series, we started to kind of crawl through connecting the Anchor wallet to the app, the OrderEntry app. And so since then, in about a week's time, obviously I haven't been allocating all my time to this. There's other work I do. But yesterday I did have some time to carve out to kind of continue and try to be consistent, because I think that's a big part of actually producing values, to be consistent in whatever you do, especially things that aren't necessarily just a day in a sense. This is like a longer term idea, right? To go from creating a simple tic-tac-toe app to maybe something larger. And that actually will be another series in this channel that you guys can take a look at. So if you're interested in that as well, not just the technical coding, but the, I guess, say the ideation or ideas side of things, I'm going to be using this channel to pretty much voice my ideas and run them by you guys, so you can poke holes at them and help me determine what the best idea to build on EOS would be, assuming it's feasible, because that's another prerequisite, of course. There are some limitations to what we can do on the blockchain and what might make sense from a business venture perspective. And I'm going to look at it from all those facets, not just the technical, but also actually having a business model that provides a service or an application that folks would want to use even outside of EOS. So with all that said, what I thought I'd start with today is just a very simple, the very simple user interface I have thus far. It's a little comical because I'm a pleb coder, so I'm just kind of starting out in my JavaScript series and honing in on some different skill sets there. In fact, probably one of the next videos you guys will see on this channel after this one will be more just some challenges or JavaScript challenges as a pleb and working through those. So I think we did a very basic series on like control flow, but the next steps will be to look at areas like closure and recursion and those types of things, because they're such an integral part in the design of these applications, especially if they use JavaScript. So what I have up on the screen thus far is the GUI for the tic-tac-toe. Obviously, we know that tic-tac-toe is made up of 9 squares, and the goal, of course, is to have 3 consecutive, X's or O's, either horizontally or vertically on a column, or they can be diagonally across. So one of the functions we'll be creating in this is a function that essentially takes positions on a tic-tac-toe game and derives, hopefully in the most efficient manner as possible, derives if a winner has been detected and who the winner is. Is it the X's or the O's, and associate that back to a player within the game. But for today's discussion, what I focused on is more the user interface, just the design side. It's not an area I'm particularly excel at, but of course with my thought is with even the commercial, say very basic ideas I have on applications on EOS, even if they are very crude in nature to start with, maybe there's folks in the community that could give me some tips, or I could even look and solicit resources outside of my skill set to help me build these applications and make them actually look and feel sleek and seamless. But today we're going to be starting out with a very basic tic-tac-toe application continuation. So what I did right here is design try to come up with a method to visualize this state of the game and kind of show an example of that. So this is a grid that I've created, and we'll go over where I guess got that information from and how you might want to use it for if you're following along in this series. What I did is I basically created a grid and a set of squares or boxes with CSS coding, and then I went ahead and defined some buttons. I don't know if this is the best way to do it, so I'm open to hear some suggestions, but what I did is I made some buttons within each of those elements, within each of those boxes, and I have an on-click event that is tied to that will fire off a function, or to invoke a function. We'll ultimately be binding then some of these to the React class we'll be building. But for now, what I did is I labeled these in kind of an index manner so I can know which box the user is clicking. So if I click, for example, what I did here, guys, is if you're interested in doing this, what you can do is you can actually create, I'll show you the code in a moment, but you can create this grid, and then you can right click on inspect, and inspect will allow you to get some context for let's see here, there we go. It'll allow you to get some context for your code. It's a great way to troubleshoot, for example, where you might have issues. In this case, I'm actually running another I'm running another example here, so I may actually have an error. I think my 3000 port's on another demo I'm working on at the moment, but for this trial that we're going to be doing, or what I'm showing you today, this is not relevant, but you want to use your console to go throughout this exercise. So if I click on this first box, you can see I kind of highlighted this X here. Obviously this is not going to change right now. I haven't coded that logic in, but if I haven't added the logic to check if it's a valid move or if they're authenticated, we're going to just ignore that for now and work in baby steps. So the objective today was to link each of the boxes with an ID, so that if I pick a particular box within the tic-tac-toe board game, I know what box that is within the overall game board. So if I click the first box, for example, what I did is I console log the target ID. So I assigned an ID, a unique ID, to each of these boxes, and then I use the on-click method that is available within like a button or other elements within the code to then spit out that I clicked on 1. So the way I labeled this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, I believe. So if I click on the second box, which is an O here, we should see 2. So you can see here on the console, you can see move request detected from position 2, and we can do these for each of these, and you'll see for each of them I get a unique number. So it tells me that it's actually working. So that's important because as we get into essentially our code, we'll need to rely on obviously some type of reference to understand. Let me pull this up. Some type of reference to understand where we are at in the process. Let me just make sure that I'm showing the right information on the screen. Yeah, that looks correct. So what I thought I'd do today is go through some of that order entry code, because we're probably going to reuse portions of this within our tic-tac-toe application, and unless we get familiar with how this thing works, we're probably not going to make a lot of progress. So I thought we'd start there. if you guys recall, we created this class OrderEntry app that extended the React.component. So again, it's just a way of creating a component. For our tic-tac-toe application, I'd expect that we'd have at least one component, our game component. We could obviously break out the different building blocks of this application to smaller components to allow it to become more manageable and to allow us to reuse certain aspects of our application that we're building within tic-tac-toe for future applications that we'll build. But for today, I think this approach right now is a pretty simple one, where it's for simple app, essentially just has one major component, and then within that we have all of our functions and whatnot. We have our constructor props. We have the state, and we initialize those and define our RPC as well to the new JSON RPC. We bind our variables or objects within our application code, and so we're binding them. We're providing a kind of a reference, I believe, to more of this global scope. So when we say, for example, this, when that function's invoked, and we'll take a look at some of those in a moment, but like when we say update account name, within that code, it uses the term this, and so it needs to know, it basically needs to know what that is. If that makes sense. It's a little maybe a little bit convoluted, but I think I'm starting to get used to that a little bit. So for each of these essentially functions, we're binding, we're providing it that reference assignment, and then we're also associating these local references within our code to that binding assignment. I believe that's what we're doing. So for example, the placeholder, let's take for example line 52, which is this dot placeholder. It equals this dot placeholder dot bind and this. So if we go in the asynchronous placeholder function definition, which is on line 62, we can see a couple things that are actually going on. The first thing we'll notice is they're using here a destruct, I believe the term is a destruction approach at essentially assigning values to account name, active user, and order names. So we've defined these terms here on line 65, and then we're essentially assigning them from our state. And in some cases, I believe those are, defaulted to probably null, or there's nothing in them to maybe begin with. But once we invoke our placeholder, we likely have the account name that's been set. We have an active user that's been set, and we have order items that have been set. So we can then assign those to the account name, active user, and order items within this code set. I believe that's how this works. So once I've defined those variables, or labels, I should say, constants. Now I can't call them labels; they're actually constants here. I have some pseudocode. I have some code I've spit it out to do some troubleshooting. So the console.log isn't relevant here, as well as the for loop. You can ignore those statements for now. We talked about the demo transaction last week, so I won't go over that too much. That's more specific to how we format transactions to talk to and send a transaction to EOS as a network, to the blockchain. Maybe not necessarily the cable or the pipes, essentially, not the like the RPC, but it's more of the formatting to actually pipe in some information, right? Once we have the connection. So that's what this is. You guys are familiar with a try statement, which is just uses the active user object dot sign transaction method. So the sign transaction here is a function that is available to us. We're not creating that ourselves. It's available within our library when we have access to that active user object, and then we throw a catch and we issue the error through our console, invoking the console.warn method, and we output the error. So all that is pretty much straightforward, I think. We've defined a render order button here, and this is essentially just a place order button, believe it or not, that is on our screen on the demo, and it's a button that is essentially always displayed in the order app. So all this method does, if you look here, it returns, this return statement in parentheses. All this is going to do is return whatever we put inside of the inner parentheses, whatever's located on the inside of the parentheses of the return statement. So in this case, our inner or our left side of our parentheses is on line 115. Our outer parentheses is on line 121. So that means all the information between those lines, so 116 through 120, all that's going to be returned when this function is basically run or called, or another way to say it is invoked. We're going to see this information dynamically rendered on our screen. And I'll talk about where we use that, but just remember that for now, that all this really is some HTML, or I should say JavaScript, JSX, I believe, language, which is kind of like HTML. There's some changes to it, like class is class name. And then if you notice here, I have on line 117, this onClick statement has some brackets, and we use those brackets to basically include logic from our code, right? That is, say, labels or variables. In this case, on the onClick, we're going to note this dot placeholder. So this dot place order. This dot place order, if you guys remember, is the function that we just reviewed a moment ago. It's on line 62. So basically what this is saying, what this order button does is it creates a P element. It then creates a button, and when we click the button, it's going to invoke the place order function, okay, which is going to attempt to send a transaction to our network. So pretty straightforward. And then we just have some string here that we put. Not sure why it's actually dynamic, because it's a string encapsulated in brackets, but it says place order. And then I'm not sure if that's actually needed. I'd be curious what others think. Maybe I'll try that. It's trivial for now, but and then we end with the closing tag of button. So each of these say objects like button will have a open tag. You'll have your on-click logic within the brackets. We'll have the string that's shown to the user in between the open and closing tags of that object, in this case button. So, and then we end with the closing parentheses tag. So again, pretty simple stuff. So here's where it kind of gets interesting. Line 127 is our component did update, and this is a function that is derived and created. And what we're doing here is we're signing our this dot props. So we're gathering all the information from our props, and we're going to use the destruction method or strategy to assign the UAL and the active user, those local instances within this set, from the props. I believe that's what this does. And then what we do is we do some checks to determine what the state of our active user is. So if we actually have an active user, so if active user is true or evaluates to true, the value evaluates to true, and we do not have within our state the state active user, so that's not present, right? It's not been, I guess, set may be the term. What we're going to do is we're going to use the this.setState method, and we're going to assign to that state this active user that we, I believe we obtained through our props. So once we gathered the information from our props, we're going to use the set state. We're going to assign that to basically that for within our state. So the local instance to our state. And then we're going to follow that up with a update account name. So once that's done, once we set our state, our active user, we're going to invoke the update account name. And the reason why we do that is because this is obviously when we set state, that is not necessarily instantaneous. So if we do not invoke the update account name, there's a chance that if we run through this code, we may not actually see that update get implemented. So by using that option, that I guess that callback option, if you will, within the set state method, it allows us to guarantee that we're able to update that account name. So that is, I believe, what that does. And we have some console log statements I just put there to learn about these states, because again, I'm a pleb, not a experienced developer. And then we do another check here that checks if we don't have a active user, but we have our state of active user is set or present, then we're going to set the state to default. So we're basically going to null out the active user and the order items, and there were some other things that we do. We have essentially this default state is defined. I'll see if I can find it up here. Yeah, default state is on line 18. So we have the default state set or equal to, we have these items within the object, right? So we have the active user, which is set to null. We have the active account, the account name, which we set to blank, and then we have the order items, which we set to 0. So that's just a way to start again from scratch, null everything out. So that's what it does if, again, we don't have that active user, but we have the set active user. So then we go into, and by the way, that runs, this component did update is a inherent method within React. It's part of the life cycle for developing these applications. So your component did update method. It's not something that's specific to EOS or anything like that, or specific to what we're doing. It's anytime you make a React application, component did update is one method that can be used to allow you to make updates to your app when any changes are detected for the objects, right, that make up your component. So if anything changes within those, say you type something in a field within your component, this, my understanding is this component did update will run. It'll run and it'll constantly look at updating these. Then we have the update account name, which we just talked about just a moment ago. So after we set the active user, if you remember, for the state, we're running this update account name. And what we're going to be doing here is trying to set the local constant account name to this state active user. And they're going to use the method getAccountName, which is, I believe, inherent and available to us once we have an active user. So if you remember that the order is important here, first we want to check that we have an active user and we have the state set to the active user, and then we can invoke this update account name. It then takes advantage of that object, that active user object, with the inherent method of getAccountName. We're going to then set the state of account name to this local instance of account name that we just defined on line 152. And after doing that, we're also, notice here, we're doing a similar thing to what we did above, where after we update our account name, we're immediately going to try to run a function here called update the account balance. And if any of that is not successful, we're going to pass to our catch statement the E, and we'll issue out the console.warn. So that's how that works. This is the logout button, line 159, and we again assign our props to local, basically a local object where we have a UAL and active user and active authenticator and logout, and that makes up the, I guess, this UAL. It's kind of defined within that object. So it's we're gonna then check if that active user is present and the active authenticator is present. And I was a little bit curious if folks know why in this example code set there's a double exclamation point. It's a negation of a negation, so I'm not sure why we would use that over, say, just saying if it's an active user and there's an active authenticator. I'm not sure why that is. It's the first time I'm actually seeing that as a pleb. But if we do have an active user and an active authenticator, what it's going to do is going to return a logout button to the screen. So that makes sense. We only want to show on our app a logout button if we're actually we have an active user and they're authenticated. If not, then we shouldn't basically allow them to have an opportunity to log out because they would never actually be logged in. And then we have a render modal button, which again, my understanding of this is more of a it's a function that we're creating, and similar to the other ones, we're going to return some JavaScript, JSX. We're going to return a button here that on the click, it's going to show modal. It's going to show, I believe, the Anchor wallet login screen. So what we're going to do in the meantime is we're going to just show connect to wallet, and it's going to have an option there as a button that the user can click. Once they click that button, on the click, it's going to show this UAL formatted form that the user interacts with to log into our application. We have our handle order update. This is an event, and takes as a, I guess it passes the event as a parameter, and it we're going to set the state for the order items to that target. So basically what we're doing is we're taking, where we're going to use this, guys, is in our field. Where we use this is in our field, in the order entry field in the demo app. You guys have access to if you're doing the certification classes. It basically uses this event, and then we're passing this event to this function, and we're going to set the state to whatever we put into the field. So that makes sense, and we'll see that in a moment. So then we have the render order form. This is equal to kind of a, I guess, an anonymous function and it then returns, or it provides then a constant order items, which is an object. I'm going to set that state. We're going to set that to the state, and then we're going to return some JavaScript, like HTML language. I'll need to get the technical term down, but we're basically returning a form. It's an order items form, and it just tells the user, items to order, comma separated. So we have a field label, and we have a field control. And you'll notice here that it is a text type. Its name is order items. The value is order items. And on change, what it's going to do is it's going to run the handle order update, which is just what we reviewed. So anytime, the way you interpret this is anytime there's a change made to that field, it's going to, anytime there's orders added or deleted, it's going to run that handle order update, and it's going to set the state to that target value. So pretty simple stuff. And lastly is our render. So this is what handles what's actually rendered out to the screen. So what we've reviewed thus far is just the methods. Now we're going to look at the render. And so the render button is going to, it's a local label. It's going to be assigned to whatever's returned from invoking this .render modal button. So that's going to depend on what state the app is in, right? If the depends on if the user's logged in. If they have an active user and they're authenticated, we may or may not see that button. The let logged in is obviously blanked, and then we're going to let the logout button initially equal null. We're going to just set these initially. Our constant order button is set to, again, the render order button. So again, depending on what's returned from invoking that function we just reviewed a moment ago, that's going to determine what we have stored in our local constant order button. And then we're going to gather from our props the UAL active user, and we'll probably be using something similar to that for our tic-tac-toe app. We're going to also then set our account name to the state that we have, right? So that is pretty straightforward to thus far. Our modal button, which we define on line 213, we're actually going to then assign that to the evaluation of not having an active user, or I should say, we're going to assign it to the evaluation of not active user and this render modal button, whatever's returned from that. So if we don't have an active user, for example, the first part of that evaluation would be true. And if we get a true statement from render modal button, then that'll evaluate to true. So modal button will then evaluate to true. Otherwise, if any of those are false, modal button will be false. Our logout button, it will be the what's returned from render logout button. So again, whatever's returned from there. Some of this may be evaluations to determine whether or not we show those things based on the state of the authentication of the user and whether the user's active. And then we have a logged in here, which is account name. It is account name if it is, then it will show logged in as account name. So it evaluates account name to see if it's present. If it is, it's going to show logged in as account name. And if not, it's going to show as a blank. So that's how you evaluate that operator. I know it's a little bit unique maybe. I'm not something I've actually been familiar with, but I'm learning through this project. And then finally, we're going to return here a div and some general formatting that explains, hey, this is a demo, EOS.io, training and certification. We have some margins. We added our button if it's there, and then we have the class name and logged in, and then we're gonna ultimately render we're gonna call the render form for that. So that's kind of how that works. Our order button and our logout button. We close our div, and then we close out this return statement. We ultimately end up closing out this render. So this render, this starting point is really, you could think of it more as logic within the render inherent function or method that's available within React. And then this return statement is actually what's printed on the screen, and it sort of leverages that logic that we've built out, or we're building out dynamically through running this app, through using these bracketed statements within our JSX. So I think it's pretty straightforward. Finally, what we do is we export this component, and that export entry goes to our app.js, and then we, I think you guys are familiar with what we did for the app.js. So the app.js basically is almost like your vanilla React app design with a few small changes. We do some imports for the UAL provider with UAL. We import our anchor from UAL anchor. We define our network settings to actually connect to our blockchain. And then we assign or associate our component order entry app, or essentially our application, with the UAL, and we give it a label or a constant order entry app consumer. So anytime you see order entry app consumer, that is essentially wrapping that. We can use that wrapped around our UAL provider, and then be able to utilize our anchor wallet. So in our function app, we simply write a return, and this is again just JavaScript JSX. We have a UAL provider, we define our chains, and then we note here the order entry app consumer as one of those elements between the UAL provider open and closing tags. And then we export this default app. And where do we get the association from? Well, if we go to index.js, we're importing React from React, and we're importing app from /app. So this is where we would then use that, and then through typical React app frameworks, we're gonna use React DOM.render, and we're gonna call simply the app within that render statement, and document.getElementById roots will then point this to root location within our HTML page. And I'll show you guys that in a moment. So if we click here, you could see our div. Took a while for my formatting to come on. But what you can see here is we have a div ID of root. So that's basically the target for what we had just discussed. So I hope this is kind of helpful. Obviously, if you're interested in doing things like this, I think the best thing to do is kind of try it yourself. And if you're interested in getting together to talk about any of this stuff as a pleb, let me know. Post your questions in the comments. And yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how it's going for you guys. So with that said, this is Phoenix. I'm going to sign off now. Hope you guys are doing well for a